For centuries, Africa's cultural heartbeat, its art, its symbols, its sacred objects, has been scattered across the world. From royal palaces to colonial museums, the treasures that once told Africa's stories now sit behind glass cases, far from home. This is not just the story of objects. It is the story of identity, memory, and power, of how wars, expeditions, and empires stripped the continent of its heritage. Across the continent, kingdoms like Benin, Asante, and Maqdala in Ethiopia saw their sacred treasures seized and shipped to Europe, often under the banner of civilization, science, or protection. Egypt's temples and Nubia's tombs were dismantled and exported piece by piece, turning African history into Western collection trophies. But the story does not end there. From Lagos to Addis Ababa, from Accra to Khartoum, voices are rising: scholars, artists, governments, and communities demanding the return of what was taken. This is a struggle, not just for possession, but for dignity, for truth, and for the right to tell one's own story. In this documentary, we trace the journey of Africa's stolen artifacts from their origins and theft to the growing global movement for restitution. Each chapter takes us into the heart of one nation's loss and its unyielding fight for reclamation. Because to understand Africa's future, we must first confront what was taken from its past. Benin City, the 1897 raid and the long road home. Benin City, in the southern region of present-day Nigeria, was once one of the most organized, prosperous, and artistically gifted kingdoms in pre-colonial Africa. For over 5 centuries, the Kingdom of Benin had flourished under a sophisticated political system headed by the Oba, the Divine King, and supported by an elaborate court of chiefs, guilds of craftsmen, and a complex network of diplomacy and trade that stretched across West Africa and beyond. Its artisans produced some of the most extraordinary bronze, ivory, and wood artworks ever made on the continent, works that captured the life, beliefs, and achievements of the Edo people. These objects, today collectively known as the Benin bronzes, were not simply decorations. They were the visual record of Benin's history, theology, and identity, a mirror of its soul. By the late 19th century, European powers had begun carving up Africa during what came to be known as the Scramble for Africa. Britain's interest in Benin was primarily economic. Palm oil, ivory, rubber, and other valuable goods were the main targets. Benin's rulers had long maintained selective trade relationships with Europeans, but they resisted colonial domination and insisted on controlling commerce through royal authority. The Oba at that time, Ovan Ramwen Nogbaisi, was determined to preserve the kingdom's independence. British traders, however, were frustrated by restrictions that kept them from direct access to Benin's markets and resources. This tension, combined with Britain's broader imperial ambitions in West Africa, set the stage for confrontation. In early 1897, a British delegation led by Acting Consul General James Phillips sought to enter Benin City to negotiate new trade terms. The Oba had sent word requesting that they delay their visit because he was in the midst of vital religious ceremonies. Phillips ignored the message and advanced toward Benin with a small escort, unaware that his move would provoke one of the most consequential clashes of the colonial era. On January 4, 1897, near Ugotan, the delegation was ambushed by Benin warriors, and most of its members were killed. The event, later called the Benin Massacre by British officials, became the pretext for a full-scale invasion. Newspapers in London painted Benin City as a barbaric place where Europeans were murdered and human sacrifice ran rampant. The British government, eager to demonstrate its authority and protect economic interests, approved a punitive expedition to teach the kingdom a lesson. In February 1897, a large British force of about 1,200 men, armed with Maxim guns and modern artillery, set sail for Benin. When they reached the city, they met fierce resistance from the Edo warriors, but the imbalance in weaponry made the outcome inevitable. The city fell after days of heavy fighting and bombardment. British troops burned the royal palace and much of the surrounding city to the ground. Amid the destruction they discovered the royal store's rooms filled with thousands of intricate brass plaques, carved ivory tusks, coral regalia, and ceremonial objects. These items were seized as war booty. Officers and soldiers divided the treasures among themselves and later sold them to pay for the costs of the campaign. What followed was one of the largest and most systematic acts of cultural looting in African history. Within months, the artifacts had spread across Europe. Auction houses in London organized sales that drew curators and private collectors from across the continent. The British Museum, the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, and several German and Dutch institutions quickly acquired large collections. By 1900, pieces of Benin art were being exhibited in Berlin, Vienna, and Paris as discoveries that demonstrated the artistic capacity of a supposedly primitive culture, a paradox that fascinated and unsettled European audiences. The bronzes were celebrated for their sophistication, but stripped of their context. They became trophies of empire rather than expressions of Edo civilization. For the people of Benin, the consequences were devastating. The Oba, captured by British troops, was exiled to Calabar, where he lived under house arrest until his death in 1914. The traditional political system was dismantled, the royal guilds were disrupted, and the community's sacred objects, many believed to embody ancestral spirits, were gone. The loss was more than material, it was spiritual and psychological. For the Edo people, these works had been part of daily and ritual life, used to honor ancestors, commemorate rulers, and record history. Their removal created a cultural amnesia that would take generations to mend. As decades passed, Benin art became a cornerstone of European ethnographic collections. Scholars and artists marveled at the craftsmanship. Early 20th century European artists such as Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse were influenced by African sculpture, including pieces from Benin, but the origin stories of these works were rarely told. In academic circles, the bronzes were often discussed in aesthetic terms, divorced from the colonial violence that brought them to Europe. It was not until the era of decolonization in the mid-20th century that Nigerian scholars and political leaders began demanding their return. When Nigeria gained independence in 1960, restitution became a matter of national pride. The National Commission for Museums and Monuments, NCMM, was established to oversee cultural heritage, and repeated requests were sent to British institutions to repatriate stolen artifacts. These appeals were met with polite refusals. The British Museum argued that its collections were protected by law and served as a global heritage. This reasoning, common among Western museums, implied that African nations lacked the resources or expertise to care for such artifacts. For Nigerians, it was a painful echo of colonial paternalism. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Nigerian artists and academics continued to push for recognition. Figures like the art historian Ekpo Ayo and museum director Frank Willett worked tirelessly to document the origins of Benin art and trace its dispersal. They established connections with European curators and organized exhibitions in Nigeria to celebrate indigenous art forms. These efforts helped shift international perception, emphasizing that Benin art was not merely tribal craft, but an advanced court art equal to any in the world. The debate over restitution gathered momentum in the 21st century. Global conversations about colonial history, race, and heritage were intensifying. African countries, supported by UNESCO and the African Union, renewed demands for the return of looted artifacts. In 2018, French President Emmanuel Macron commissioned the Savoy Report, which concluded that African heritage taken under colonial conditions should be returned to its countries of origin. The report cited Benin as a central case study and called for sweeping reform of museum policies. It marked a turning point. European governments could no longer ignore the moral and political weight of restitution. Germany was the first major power to act decisively. In 2022, the German government signed an agreement with Nigeria to transfer ownership of 1,130 Benin objects from German museums. The agreement allowed for some items to remain in Germany on long-term loan, while others would be physically returned to Nigeria. This hybrid arrangement acknowledged both historical justice and practical collaboration. In 2023, the Netherlands followed, announcing the restitution of 114 Benin bronzes, one of the largest single returns to date. The University of Aberdeen and Jesus College, Cambridge, in the UK also returned bronzes from their collections. Each handover ceremony was widely covered by the media, featuring Nigerian officials, Edo traditional leaders, and European diplomats. The mood was emotional, a mixture of triumph, relief, and the lingering sense that the process had taken far too long. At home, Nigeria prepared to receive the artifacts. The Edo state government, in collaboration with international partners, launched plans for the Edo Museum of West African Art, IMOWA, an ambitious project to house returned items and promote cultural education. Designed by renowned architect David Ajay, IMOWA symbolizes a broader vision, not only to store the bronzes, but to contextualize them within African narratives. The museum will stand on the site of the former royal quarter, a deliberate act of reconnection between the city, its people, and their lost heritage. While symbolic progress has been made, challenges persist. The British Museum, which holds around 900 Benin objects, the largest single collection, has not yet committed to permanent restitution, citing legal restrictions under the British Museum Act of 1963. However, discussions are ongoing to establish a partnership model similar to Germany's. Many observers see this as a test of sincerity for Western institutions that claim to support decolonization. The issue also raises complex questions within Nigeria itself. Where should the returned artifacts be housed? Who should manage them, the federal government, Edo State, or the Oba's palace? These debates reflect the intersection of culture, politics, and ownership. For Edo traditionalists, the bronzes are royal property belonging to the Oba and his ancestors. For Nigeria as a nation, they are part of a collective identity that transcends regional boundaries. Balancing these perspectives is crucial to ensuring that restitution heals rather than reignites old tensions. Beyond the legal and political dimensions lies the human story. For ordinary people in Benin City, the bronzes represent memory. Many families can trace their lineage to the guilds that created the artworks, the Igun Eronmon bronze casters, the Igbasamwan ivory carvers, and others. These craftsmen worked under royal patronage, passing techniques from father to son. The looting in 1897 shattered this continuity, but the skills survived. Today, bronze casting still thrives in Benin City's Igun Street, recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. When descendants of the original guilds see images of the returned bronzes, they do not view them as distant museum pieces. They see them as living relatives returning home. Culturally, the restitution debate has inspired a renaissance. Nigerian filmmakers, artists, and writers have used the 1897 invasion as a metaphor for cultural resilience. The art of Peju Layewola, for example, explores intergenerational memory and the feminine perspective of loss. Exhibitions such as Benin 1897, Commemorative Art, and The Continuing Story attracted wide attention for blending historical narrative with contemporary art. This movement demonstrates that restitution is not only about physical objects, but also about reclaiming the power to tell one's own story. Economically, the return of artifacts holds potential for cultural tourism and education. Benin City could become a hub for heritage tourism, attracting visitors eager to learn about pre-colonial African art. For Nigeria, which has long sought to diversify its economy, cultural heritage represents an underused asset. Properly managed, it could generate revenue while reinforcing national pride. Yet officials emphasize that restitution is a matter of justice before it is a matter of economics. These objects were taken by force. Returning them is the minimum acknowledgement of historical wrong. Internationally, the Benin case has influenced similar movements across Africa, from Ghana to Ethiopia and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Each success story adds moral pressure on institutions still holding African artifacts. European museums are increasingly conducting provenance research to identify items obtained through colonial violence. Some have even opened digital archives to allow African scholars access to catalogs once kept hidden. This transparency, though partial, signals a changing climate. Still, critics caution that restitution must be more than token gestures. A handful of returned objects cannot undo centuries of extraction. For true repair, there must be investment in cultural infrastructure, education, and community access. The Benin bronzes should not become political trophies displayed in elite spaces. They should reconnect with the people whose ancestors made them. The symbolism of their return extends beyond Nigeria. It challenges the moral foundations of global museums, forcing a reevaluation of what universal heritage means. If heritage truly belongs to humanity, then humanity must also reckon with how it was taken. In the Benin case, restitution is not merely about moving art across borders, but about restoring dignity to a civilization misrepresented for generations. As of 2025, more than 200 Benin bronzes have officially returned or are in the process of being repatriated. The Oba of Benin has welcomed these developments, describing the returns as the restoration of our spirit. The ceremonies that accompany each handover often include traditional prayers, drumming, and libations rituals meant to welcome the ancestors back to their rightful home. These moments are deeply emotional, serving as bridges between past and present. The journey, however, is far from complete. Thousands of pieces remain scattered across Europe and North America. Some are in private hands and may never be traced. Others sit in museum storerooms, unseen by the public. Each item carries its own story: a plaque depicting a royal procession, an ivory mask of the Queen Mother, a bronze head of an Oba, each a fragment of Benin's history awaiting reunion. Nigeria's task is immense, but necessary: to document, to educate, and to ensure that future generations understand both the glory of their heritage and the injustice of its loss. In the final measure, the saga of the Benin bronzes is a mirror of Africa's broader encounter with colonialism. It embodies the violence of conquest, the arrogance of empire, and the enduring strength of a people who refuse to forget. More than a century after the palace burned, Benin City stands again as a symbol of resilience. The sound of metalwork still rings through Egon Street, where artisans shape new bronzes with the same ancient techniques, this time telling stories of survival and return. For them, each hammer strike is an act of remembrance, each finished piece a declaration that Benin lives. Maqdala, Ethiopia, sacred tablets, shields, and the plunder of a kingdom. In the northern highlands of Ethiopia, on a rugged plateau perched above the Blue Nile Gorge, lies the fortress town of Maqdala, also spelled Magdala. It was here, in April 1868, that the British Expeditionary Force under Sir Robert Napier defeated the army of Emperor Tawadros II in a decisive campaign and event that would cast a long shadow over Ethiopia's history and leave a legacy of looted religious artifacts, royal treasures, and cultural trauma that still echoes today. Tawadros II, ruling 1855 to 1868, emerged at a time when Ethiopia faced internal fragmentation and external pressure from European powers and missionaries. Determined to unify the country and assert his authority, he embarked on military campaigns and sought centralized control. He invited European missionaries and envoys to his court, hoping to modernize and receive recognition from European monarchs. When diplomatic overtures failed, he imprisoned several British subjects, precipitating the British punitive expedition of 1867 to 1868. Maqdala, located on an isolated mesa, became his stronghold and symbol of resistance. The fortress housed the imperial court, the national treasury, and numerous religious relics belonging to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Among these treasures were gold and silver crosses, illuminated manuscripts, royal regalia, tabots, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's altar tablets representing the Ark of the Covenant, processional chests, and other liturgical objects of deep spiritual and national significance. In late 1867, the British sent a force of about 13,000 troops and support personnel under Robert Napier, accompanied by Indian contingent units and African auxiliary forces. Their objective: to secure the release of British hostages and assert British prestige. In April 1868, the British and Allied forces reached Maqdala after navigating treacherous terrain and suffering hardship from disease and logistical difficulties. On the 13th of April, 1868, the decisive assault began. Emperor Tawadros, recognizing the defeat, killed himself rather than surrender, and his army was routed. The fortress was systematically looted, the churches destroyed, and large numbers of Christians and non-combatants caught in the violence. British soldiers, encouraged by the prospect of prizes, carried away vast quantities of objects. According to museum records today, many of the items now in British collections were officially purchased from the Army Prize Committee auction held on the 20 to 21st of April 1868 on the Delanta Plain near Maqdala. One example, a necklace held by the British Museum with registration number AF 1868 1001 3 has provenance described as looted by Richard Holmes at Maqdala, 13th of April 1868, plundered by British and Indian troops. Another belt, AF 1868, 1001.2, is also recorded similarly. These items demonstrate the intimate connection between the looting event and their eventual presence in Western collections. The objects removed from Maqdala were not simply decorative. They formed part of the religious and sovereign apparatus of Imperial Ethiopia. Tabots, in particular, are sacred. Each Ethiopian Orthodox church houses a tabot, a black wood, stone, or metal sheet bearing the image of the Ark of the Covenant, and only priests handle it. Removal of a tabot therefore represents not only loss of art, but spiritual violation. Other items taken include gold crowns, processional horns, silver-plated cups, illuminated manuscripts, Ethiopian regalia, shields inscribed with Maqdala 13th April 1868. One shield identified in a UK auction catalog carried the inscription. According to Ethiopian sources, items returned in November 2021 included a crown, a shield, a set of silver cups, and other liturgical objects collectively described as the largest single restitution of Maqdala-era artifacts in Ethiopian history. For Ethiopians, the events of 1868 and the subsequent dispersal of royal and religious objects represent a deep cultural wound. Ambassador Teferi Males Desta, speaking upon the 2021 restitution, described the looted items as a wound. Lives were lost, families separated, traumas inflicted, culture was looted. The removal of these objects severed the continuity of ritual practice, deprived communities of their sacred heritage, and symbolized the inequality of power between colonizer and colonized. The fortress of Maqdala remains a pilgrimage site for Ethiopians, remembering both the valor of Tewodros and the indignity of his defeat. Decades passed with little systematic restitution. However, over the past decade, the Ethiopian government, the Ethiopian Heritage Authority, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church intensified efforts to reclaim the looted material. In September 2021, a ceremony in London marked the handing over of 13 artifacts looted in 1868. These included a processional cross, a priestly crown, a shield, and other items. For the first time, the magnitude of the return was described as the largest single restitution in Ethiopian history. The symbolism of the return was powerful. When a shield inscribed with Maqdala 13th April 1868 was offered at auction in the United Kingdom in 2024, Ethiopian officials intervened and the sale was withdrawn. It signaled that African governments and civil society are no longer passive bystanders in heritage debates. Despite these advances, many obstacles remain. Some institutions in the UK hold tabots and other Maqdala-era objects whose provenance is clear, yet institutional or legal constraints hinder their return. For example, the Westminster Abbey announced in 2024 it had agreed in principle to return a tabot to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but the logistics and legal frameworks remain unresolved. The British Museum is under investigation by the UK Information Commissioner's Office for alleged secrecy over some tabots in its collection. One practical challenge lies in capacity. Where should returned objects be placed, maintained, and displayed? In Ethiopia, preservation infrastructure, security, and conservation expertise must be strengthened. Yet many Ethiopian officials emphasize that such concerns are not sufficient justification for refusing returns. The Maqdala case resonates beyond Ethiopia. It highlights how colonial military expeditions often involved not only territory but cultural plunder, how religious artifacts were treated as trophies, and how restitution is not simply a matter of repatriation, but an act of healing. The case also pressures foreign institutions to examine their collections' provenance and to engage in collaborative relationships with source communities. It suggests that returning objects can form part of reconciliation processes and cultural diplomacy. Behind the artifacts, there are human stories. Priests who lost sacred objects, children of Emperor Tewodros, such as his son Prince Alamayehu, who became exiles, and communities whose liturgical and cultural continuity was broken. In Ethiopia today, when returned items are displayed or used in sacred contexts, they serve not only as museum pieces, but as living links to the past. Justice in this context means more than the physical return of objects. It means recognition of the injustice of their removal, transparency about ownership, involvement of source communities in decisions, capacity building so the artifacts are not just restored but reintegrated, and the education of global audiences about the history of plunder. As Ethiopia continues to press its case, the Maqdala treasures stand as a symbol of what many African nations are asking for, not charity, but restitution. Asante, Ghana, Gold Regalia, the Golden Stool, and new models of return. The story of the Asante Kingdom and its looted gold regalia represents one of the most striking examples of cultural dispossession in West Africa. It is a story intertwined with Britain's imperial ambitions on the Gold Coast, the spiritual and political power of the Asante Hene, King of Asante, and the continuing quest to recover what was taken, not only objects of immeasurable beauty, but emblems of sovereignty itself. By the early 18th century, the Asante, or Ashanti, Empire had risen as a dominant power in what is now central Ghana. Its capital, Kumasi, stood at the heart of a confederation of Akan states united under the Golden Stool, the Sika Dwa Kofi, believed to have descended from the heavens. The stool was not merely a symbol of kingship, it embodied the soul of the Asante nation, the living spirit of all Asante people, past and present. Gold held sacred and political meaning. Asante was known across West Africa for its abundance of gold deposits, and artisans in Kumasi were master goldsmiths, creating regalia crowns, swords, bracelets, and ceremonial ornaments used in royal processions, diplomacy, and rituals. Every item bore layers of spiritual symbolism. A pendant might represent wisdom or authority. A stool might embody lineage and continuity. Gold thus functioned both as currency and as a language of power. The British presence on the Gold Coast began in the 17th century through the Royal African Company and later the African Company of Merchants. Initially, the relationship was commercial, but by the early 19th century, Britain's abolition of the slave trade, 1807, and its interest in legitimate commerce, especially palm oil and gold, intensified political engagement. Tensions soon rose between the Asante and the British. The Asante sought to maintain access to coastal trade routes through Fante territories, while the British aimed to protect coastal allies and expand influence. The First Anglo-Asante War erupted in 1824 when a British expedition under Governor Sir Charles McCarthy confronted Asante forces near Nsamanko. The Asante army, estimated at 10,000 strong, annihilated the British force. McCarthy was killed, and his skull was later used in ritual ceremonies, an act the British viewed as barbaric, but which for the Asante was a symbolic assertion of victory. This first war established a pattern, cycles of hostility, uneasy truces, and renewed conflict. The British, though defeated initially, did not forget the humiliation. Over the next 70 years, they would return repeatedly, each time better equipped and more determined to subjugate the Asante kingdom. The most significant looting occurred during the Third Anglo-Asante War of 1873 to 1874. Led by Sir Garnet Wolseley, British forces invaded Asante territory, citing the killing of traders and the obstruction of trade routes. In reality, the campaign formed part of Britain's strategy to consolidate its West African empire after establishing the Gold Coast colony. In February 1874, Wolseley's troops entered Kumasi. The Asante Hene, Kofi Karakari, unable to defend the capital against heavy bombardment, abandoned the city. The British army burned Kumasi to the ground and seized enormous quantities of gold regalia, weapons, and royal objects. The official war report recorded the capture of gold masks, swords of office, state chairs, and ornaments of purest gold. Some items were melted down for bullion, others were shipped to Britain as trophies of war. The war indemnity imposed on Asante 50,000 ounces of gold was an astronomical sum, effectively crippling the kingdom's economy. The physical destruction of Kumasi and the removal of its regalia struck at the core of Asante identity. The royal palace, once adorned with gold ornaments and ivory carvings, was reduced to ashes. Among the items taken were the royal state swords, afena, ceremonial headpieces, and intricate gold badges of the Asanteans chiefs. Many of these found their way into British regimental museums, the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum. Soldiers and officers of the 42nd Regiment, the Black Watch, and the 23rd Welsh Fusiliers are documented as having brought home gold ornaments and symbolic items from Kumasi. Although the golden stool itself was never taken, its sanctity was tested in 1900, one of the most dramatic episodes in African colonial history. After Asante had been declared a British protectorate in 1896, the British exiled Asantehene Prempeh I to the Seychelles. In his absence, colonial administrators attempted to assert direct control. The new British governor, Sir Frederick Hodgson, demanded that the golden stool, the soul of the nation, be brought for him to sit upon. His words shocked the assembled chiefs. For the Asante, this demand was blasphemous. The golden stool was never meant to be sat upon, not even by the Asantehene himself. Hodgson's arrogance ignited the War of the Golden Stool, 1900, led by Ya Asantewa, the Queen Mother of Ejisu, who rallied the chiefs and warriors to defend Asante sovereignty. Her leadership remains one of the most celebrated acts of female resistance in African history. The British eventually suppressed the uprising after months of fierce fighting, but they failed to capture the stool. It was hidden in the bush by loyal priests and rediscovered only years later. Yet during the campaign, more gold regalia and state objects were looted from shrines and palaces around Kumasi. These included the ceremonial swords and ornaments belonging to Ya Asantewa's family, many of which later appeared in British collections. Scholars estimate that over 4,000 Asante objects were taken between 1874 and 1900. Today, significant portions are held in the British Museum, London, over 100 gold and brass objects, including ceremonial swords, linguist staffs, and rings. The Victoria and Albert Museum, V&A, gold jewelry, war booty from 1874, and regalia gifted to the museum by returning officers. The Wallace Collection and the Royal Regiment Museum's smaller holdings of trophies collected by regimental soldiers. Private collections, many items dispersed through auction houses, such as Sotheby's in the early 20th century. In Ghana, only a small number of original pre-1874 pieces remain, mostly preserved in the Menhia Palace Museum, opened in 1995 by Asantehene Otumfuo Opoku Ware II. Most of these pieces were either hidden during colonial times or repatriated through diplomatic means after Ghana's independence. After Ghana gained independence in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah, the issue of looted Asante regalia emerged periodically. Yet formal restitution discussions were rare. The Asantehene's palace maintained correspondence with British museums, but early efforts were often dismissed under the claim that the items were legally acquired as spoils of war, a justification no longer accepted under modern ethics. Momentum for restitution revived in the 21st century. Following international debates on African heritage, particularly after France's 2018 SAR-Savoy report, Ghana's call for the return of Asante treasures gained diplomatic traction. In January 2024, a landmark agreement was reached. The British Museum and the V&A Museum signed a deal with the Menhia Palace to return 32 Asante royal treasures to Ghana. Although formally structured as a long-term loan because of British legal restrictions, the items would be physically displayed in Kumasi at the Menhia Palace Museum. They included gold regalia, ornaments, and ceremonial swords taken during the 1874 and 1900 conflicts. This was the first major restitution from British national collections to an African royal court in over a century. British Museum Director Hartwig Fisher described the collaboration as a new form of equitable partnership. The Asantehene, Otumfuo Osei 222, welcomed the decision, noting that the return is not just about objects, it is about reconnecting our people with our history. The emotional resonance was immense. At the handover ceremony, chiefs and elders performed libations, invoking the ancestors who had defended Asante sovereignty. For many Ghanaians, it symbolized a partial healing of wounds inflicted by empire. The 2024 restitution was structured as a long-term renewable loan, initially 6 years. Critics argue that calling it a loan perpetuates colonial hierarchies, implying that Britain owns the artifacts it took by force. However, museum officials maintain that British law, the British Museum Act of 1963, prevents full transfer of ownership. Advocates of restitution in Ghana and the UK alike are campaigning for amendments to such laws, arguing that moral restitution should not be constrained by outdated statutes. Another issue concerns conservation and display. The Manhaya Palace Museum is being upgraded to international standards with climate control and security systems to ensure proper care for the returning artifacts. The collaboration includes joint research and digital documentation, allowing scholars from both Ghana and Britain to study the pieces. This model of shared stewardship is emerging as a pragmatic path forward for other African nations seeking restitution. While most of the looted regalia were material objects, the golden stool remains at the heart of Asante identity. It has never left Ghana and never will. Carved from a single block of wood and covered in gold leaf, it is said to have descended from the sky in 1701, carried by a cloud of white dust and settling gently on the knees of the first Asantehene, Osei Tutu. It embodies the sun sum, the spiritual essence of the Asante people. Its inviolability explains why the British never succeeded in seizing it, despite their repeated attempts. The story of its protection is central to Asante memory. When Ya Asantewa led her warriors in 1900, she declared, "If you, the men of Asante, will not go forward, then we will. We, the women, will fight for the golden stool." That spirit still animates discussions of restitution today. The stool's endurance serves as a metaphor for resilience, a symbol that although physical treasures may be taken, cultural identity endures. The return of the Asante gold objects coincides with a broader revival of Ghanaian cultural heritage. The Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, KHI, and the University of Ghana have launched programs in museum studies, conservation, and heritage law. Younger Ghanaians, through film, literature, and fashion, are reinterpreting Asante motifs to express pride in their ancestry. In Kumasi, artisans in the Adam and Kajetia quarters continue the ancient craft of goldsmithing, producing ceremonial jewelry using traditional lost wax casting methods. Many view their work as an act of cultural continuity, bridging past and present. The restitution of original regalia thus energizes not only museums, but also local economies, cultural education, and identity formation. The Asante case has become a model for negotiated restitution. It demonstrates that collaboration, transparency, and respect can yield tangible results even within existing legal frameworks. Other African nations, including Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Senegal, have cited the Ghana-UK partnership as a precedent for their own claims. It also highlights the role of monarchies and traditional institutions in heritage diplomacy. While many African states are republics, the Asantehene's moral authority as custodian of Asante culture proved crucial in negotiations. His approach balanced respect for tradition with pragmatic diplomacy, avoiding confrontation while achieving meaningful restitution. Despite progress, challenges persist. Thousands of Asante items remain in European and North American collections, many without proper provenance documentation. Some are traded in private auctions, often without acknowledgement of their colonial origins. Ghana's Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture is developing legislation to protect national heritage and to track artifacts through digital registries. Another challenge is sustainability. Restitution is not an endpoint, but a beginning. The returned artifacts must be properly integrated into national narratives, educational curricula, and museum systems that engage the public. If neglected or politicized, they risk becoming static symbols rather than living heritage. The return of Asante regalia is ultimately about restoring dignity. When the artifacts arrived in Kumasi in 2024, crowds lined the streets to witness their unveiling. Elders chanted praises, drums echoed across the palace grounds, and school children waved miniature flags bearing the Adinkra symbols of wisdom and unity. For them, these objects were not relics of the past, but evidence that Asante civilization was and remains world-class. Restitution also reconnects diasporic Africans with their origins. Many Ghanaians abroad, especially in the United Kingdom and the United States, view the Asante treasures as shared heritage. Exhibitions in London and Kumasi are being designed to travel between continents, illustrating that cultural ownership and global accessibility can coexist. The Asante experience marks a turning point in global museology. It challenges institutions to shift from possessive custodianship to partnership. The gold regalia, once displayed as trophies of imperial conquest, now stand as testaments to cultural resilience. When asked what restitution meant to him, Otumfuo Osei Tutu Sekt replied, It means that the ancestors have spoken, that what was taken in violence can return in peace. That sentiment captures the essence of Africa's wider restitution movement. Not vengeance, but balance. Not blame, but acknowledgement. Through Asante's example, the world witnesses that returning stolen heritage is not about the past alone, it is about justice in the present and identity in the future. Egypt and Sudan, the politics of antiquities and the struggle for ownership. For centuries, the deserts and river valleys of Egypt and Sudan have yielded some of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries in human history. Monuments, statues, mummies, papyri, and relics of two of Africa's oldest civilizations. Yet much of what is celebrated as the glory of ancient Egypt, or Nubia, in Western museums was taken under colonial or semi-colonial conditions. The story of these antiquities is not only about archaeology, it is also about power, politics, and ownership questions that still dominate relations between African nations and global institutions today. By the 19th century, Egypt had become the object of European fascination and imperial ambition. Napoleon Bonaparte's 1798 expedition to Egypt, accompanied by scholars and artists, produced the monumental Description de l'Egypte and opened the floodgates of Western Egyptology. This encounter set the stage for a century of intense exploration and removal of artifacts. Under Ottoman and later British domination, Egypt's control over its own antiquities was weak. Excavations by European archaeologists were often conducted with little oversight, and objects were exported freely. The system of partageth division of finds between the excavating mission and the host country was introduced in the late 19th century and institutionalized by the Egyptian Antiquities Service. In practice, partage heavily favored foreign teams who received the more spectacular objects for export. Sudan, then known as Anglo-Egyptian Sudan after the 1899 condominium agreement between Britain and Egypt, was subject to similar exploitation. Early 20th century expeditions by British and American archaeologists in Nubia and at sites such as Meroe, Kerma, and Gebel Barkal resulted in the export of hundreds of sculptures, stelae, and royal artifacts to London, Boston, and Berlin. This systematic dispersal was justified at the time as scientific cooperation. In reality, it reflected colonial hierarchies. European powers presented themselves as guardians of world heritage, while Egypt and Sudan were treated as suppliers of ancient wonders. Few objects symbolize Egypt's loss of control over its heritage more clearly than the Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1799 by a French soldier during Napoleon's campaign near the town of Rashid, Rosetta. The basalt slab contained inscriptions in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek, providing the key to deciphering ancient Egyptian writing. When the British defeated the French in Egypt in 1801, they seized the Rosetta Stone as part of the capitulation of Alexandria. It was shipped to London and installed in the British Museum, where it remains today. For Egypt, the stone is not merely an academic artifact, but a national symbol. It was found on Egyptian soil, inscribed by Egyptian scribes, and embodies Egypt's linguistic and cultural continuity. Repeated requests for its return, most prominently in 2003, 2017, and again in 2022, by the Egyptian archaeologist and former Antiquities Minister, Dr. Zahi Hawashov, been rebuffed by the British Museum, which argues that it acquired the stone legally under the terms of early 19th century treaties. The debate illustrates the core tension in restitution politics: colonial legality versus moral legitimacy. While the museum cites documentation of transfer, Egypt insists that any treaty signed under military occupation cannot represent free consent. Another emblematic case involves the bust of Queen Nefertiti, one of the world's most recognizable sculptures. Unearthed in 1912 by a German archaeological mission led by Ludwig Borchardt at Tel El Amarna, it was sent to Germany under the partage system. The Egyptian Antiquities Service approved the division, but records later revealed that Borchardt may have concealed the bust's importance during the inspection, describing it as a painted plaster bust rather than a masterpiece in limestone and stucco. Since 1923, the bust has been displayed in Berlin, currently housed in the Neues Museum. Egypt has repeatedly requested its return, most notably in 1935, 2009, and 2011. Each time, German authorities have declined, claiming the acquisition was legal and that the object is too fragile to move. For many Egyptians, however, Nefertiti's image in a European museum epitomizes how colonial powers appropriated not only material culture, but also the narrative of ancient Egypt as a Western discovery. In Sudan, the removal of artifacts was less publicly dramatized, but equally consequential. During the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s, UNESCO coordinated the international campaign to save the monuments of Nubia, leading to the relocation of temples such as Abu Simbel. While the campaign saved monuments from flooding, it also sanctioned the export of many artifacts to foreign museums as a form of reward for participating nations. Today, Nubian artifacts from Sudan's royal sites are spread across the British Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Louvre, and the Berlin State Museums. Among them are statues of Kushite pharaohs, bronze offering tables, and pottery that bear witness to an African empire, often overshadowed by its northern neighbor. Sudanese scholars argue that these objects are essential for reconstructing a distinctly African perspective on Nile Valley civilization, one that predates and parallels ancient Egypt. Egypt began asserting control over its antiquities in the mid-19th century. The creation of the Service des Antiquités de l'Égypte in 1858 under Auguste Mariette marked the first official effort to regulate excavation and export. Later, under French and then Egyptian directors, stricter laws limited exportation. However, British occupation from 1882 to 1956 complicated enforcement as major archaeological institutions like the British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute maintained privileged excavation rights. After independence, Egypt's Antiquities Law of 1983 formally prohibited the export of antiquities and declared all finds property of the state. Sudan enacted similar legislation after its 1956 independence, but by then, thousands of artifacts had already left the country. The global shift came with the 1970 UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property. Egypt ratified the convention in 1973, Sudan in 1974. Although the convention is not retroactive, it provided a moral platform for restitution campaigns. Egypt has since used bilateral diplomacy to secure returns. Notable cases include the 2010 repatriation of a 3,000-year-old wooden coffin lid from the St. Louis Art Museum and the 2019 recovery of a gilded coffin of the priest Nejamank from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, proven to have been looted in 2011 and smuggled through Paris. These successes demonstrate that restitution is not limited to 19th century colonial seizures, but also to modern trafficking. For Egypt, both are facets of the same injustice, the continuing external control over its heritage. Ownership of antiquities is not only about property rights, it is about who tells history. Western museums have long presented Egyptian civilization as part of a universal heritage detached from the modern Egyptian nation. Exhibitions often emphasize pharaohs and pyramids, but marginalize the African and Arab identities of contemporary Egyptians and Sudanese. This framing has political consequences. In Sudan, for example, the Nubian heritage of the Kushite kingdom, whose rulers once conquered Egypt, has often been interpreted through foreign narratives that minimize its African context. Sudanese archaeologists, such as Salah Ahmed and Intisar Sogharoun, have argued that control over archaeological research is vital to national identity and post-colonial reconstruction. In Egypt, the government has built new institutions, such as the Grand Egyptian Museum near Giza, set to open fully in the mid-2020s, designed not only to house artifacts, but to reclaim Egyptology as an Egyptian field. The museum's narrative positions Egypt's past as part of an unbroken African continuum, challenging the Eurocentric vision of ancient civilization. Egypt's demands for restitution often encounter resistance, framed as offers of long-term loans. In 2002, when Egypt requested the return of the Rosetta Stone for the opening of the Grand Egyptian Museum, the British Museum proposed instead to lend the object for a temporary exhibition, with Egypt acknowledging British ownership. Egyptian authorities rejected the offer, arguing that cultural sovereignty cannot be borrowed. A similar tension exists in Sudan's case. The Sudan National Museum in Khartoum has limited resources and has endured periods of civil conflict, yet Sudanese curators insist that partnerships should be based on equality, not dependency. For them, offers of loans perpetuate colonial hierarchies under the guise of cooperation. The politics of antiquities in Egypt and Sudan also intersect with tourism and economic development. Cultural heritage sites attract millions of visitors annually, forming a crucial source of revenue. Consequently, the return of artifacts is not only symbolic, but economically strengthens domestic museums and supports local industries. Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities regularly announces new discoveries to global media, blending archaeology with national branding. Each announcement carries an implicit message: Egypt no longer needs foreign custodians to study or display its heritage. Sudan, recovering from decades of political instability, is following a similar path by promoting the archaeological zones of Meroe and Jebel Barkal as World Heritage attractions under Sudanese management. The 21st century has witnessed renewed global attention to restitution, partly driven by African activism and European reassessments. The 2018 SAR-Savoy report, commissioned by French President Emmanuel Macron, recommended the return of African artifacts taken during colonialism. Egypt and Sudan have since used its findings to strengthen their cases. In 2021, Egypt successfully recovered several artifacts from Britain and the United States through diplomatic channels, including statues and fragments stolen from Saqqara. In 2023, Sudan formally requested the British Museum and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston to provide inventories of Nubian artifacts removed during colonial excavations. These efforts reflect a broader shift. Restitution is no longer framed solely as a legal dispute, but as cultural diplomacy. Returning artifacts can build goodwill, foster academic collaboration, and repair long-standing mistrust between nations. Despite progress, challenges remain immense. Some Western institutions fear that mass repatriations would empty their galleries or set precedents for global claims. They also question the capacity of source countries to ensure conservation and public access. African nations counter that such arguments reproduce colonial paternalism. Egypt's new museums, conservation laboratories, and international partnerships demonstrate that capacity is growing. Sudan's museums, though affected by conflict, are supported by UNESCO and regional networks developing preservation skills. Another challenge lies in verifying provenance. Many artifacts were poorly documented, with excavation records missing or intentionally vague. Establishing legal ownership decades later can be complex. Collaborative digital archives and open-access databases are emerging as tools to address this. Beyond legalities, restitution is a moral question. For Egyptians and Sudanese, these artifacts are part of living heritage connection between ancient civilizations and modern communities. The removal of mummies, for example, is not just scientific study, but the disturbance of ancestors. Egyptian scholars have long criticized the display of human remains in foreign museums as disrespectful and dehumanizing. Similarly, for Nubians displaced by the Aswan Dam, artifacts taken abroad are reminders of a homeland submerged underwater. Their return represents not nostalgia, but recognition of loss and resilience. In recent years, both Egypt and Sudan have proposed models of shared heritage that combine restitution with international cooperation. Instead of isolating artifacts in national museums, they envision rotating exhibitions, joint conservation projects, and co-authored research. The goal is not to divide heritage, but to rebalance authority. Some European museums have begun to respond. The Humboldt Forum in Berlin, under criticism for colonial collections, now presents ancient Egyptian and Nubian artifacts with explicit acknowledgement of their contested histories. British and French institutions have opened dialogue on joint curatorial initiatives, though without committing to permanent returns. The story of Egypt and Sudan's looted antiquities is ultimately a story of sovereignty. The objects in question, the Rosetta Stone, the Nefertiti bust, the Kushite statues, are more than archaeological specimens. They are fragments of African memory, taken at a time when Africa had little power to resist. For more than 2 centuries, Western museums have displayed these treasures as emblems of universal civilization. Today, Egypt and Sudan challenge that narrative, insisting that universality must coexist with justice. Restitution, they argue, is not about erasing history, but correcting it, about allowing Africa to tell its own story in its own voice. As debates continue, the struggle over these artifacts reminds the world that the past is never truly past. It lives in the objects that cross borders, the museums that hold them, and the nations still fighting for their return. Modern Africa, the new wave of restitution and cultural reawakening. The 21st century has witnessed an unprecedented shift in how the world confronts the legacy of colonial plunder. Across Africa, governments, scholars, artists, and activists are challenging the historical imbalance that allowed Western powers to possess and profit from objects taken during conquest and empire. From Nigeria to Senegal, from the Democratic Republic of Congo to South Africa, a new movement for restitution is reshaping not only museum practice, but the very meaning of cultural sovereignty. For decades after independence, calls for the return of African artifacts were largely symbolic. African leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah and Leopold Sédar Senghor spoke about cultural emancipation, but the political and economic crises of the post-colonial era limited their leverage. Western institutions argued that their collections were held for humanity, portraying themselves as neutral guardians of universal heritage. This began to change in the early 2000s and accelerated after 2017, when French President Emmanuel Macron, speaking in Ouagadougou, declared that African heritage cannot remain captive in European museums. He commissioned a landmark study by Senegalese economist Felwine Sarr and French art historian Bénédicte Savoy. Their 2018 report sur la restitution du patrimoine culturel africain recommended the unconditional return of objects taken by force or through inequitable colonial circumstances. The report transformed global discourse. It offered not merely moral arguments, but detailed frameworks for inventory audits, provenance research, and diplomatic procedures. Most importantly, it recognized African states and communities as legitimate custodians of their heritage. Nowhere has the restitution debate been more visible than in Nigeria's campaign to recover the Benin bronzes. Thousands of brass and ivory artworks looted by British troops during the 1897 punitive expedition against the Kingdom of Benin, present-day Edo State. For over a century, these masterpieces, plaques, heads, figurines, ceremonial swords, were scattered among more than 160 institutions worldwide, with major holdings in the British Museum, Berlin's Ethnological Museum, and U.S. universities. In 2021 and 2022, a remarkable wave of restitutions began. Germany signed a formal agreement with Nigeria to return over 1,100 Benin objects. By 2023, more than 20 pieces had already been transferred, including plaques returned from Berlin and Hamburg. The University of Aberdeen in Scotland became the first Western institution to complete an unconditional repatriation of a Benin bronze head of an Obaciting ethical grounds rather than legal obligation. In the United States, the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African Art announced the return of 29 Benin pieces, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art followed with 2 ivory plaques. These returns coincided with Nigeria's plan to construct the Edo Museum of West African Art, EMOOA, in Benin City, designed by Ghanaian-British architect David Adjaye. Conceived as both a research center and a public museum, EMOOA aims to reintegrate the returned bronzes into local cultural life. Yet the process has not been without controversy. In 2023, debates emerged between Nigeria's federal authorities, the Edo state government, and the Benin royal palace over ownership and custody. The royal family argued that the artifacts belonged to the Oba's ancestral trust, not the state. This internal negotiation reflects a broader question across Africa. Once artifacts return, who owns them, the nation, the community, or the lineage from which they were taken? Nevertheless, the Benin Bronze Campaign marks a watershed moment. It demonstrated that sustained advocacy, international solidarity, and digital transparency can compel once reluctant museums to act. While Nigeria's campaign represents legal and political restitution, Senegal's approach highlights cultural renewal. In 2018, Dakar inaugurated the Musée de Civilisations Noires, Museum of Black Civilizations, a vast modern complex envisioned by Senghor decades earlier. The museum was built partly with Chinese funding, but designed around an African philosophical concept teranga, hospitality, and the collective heritage of Black peoples worldwide. When Macron promised to return Senegalese artifacts, the museum became a ready recipient. In 2021, France returned the saber of Omar Tall, Omar Sidal, the 19th century Muslim leader who resisted French expansion in West Africa. The saber had long been displayed at the Musée de l'Armée in Paris. Its return was a symbolic victory for Senegal and a test case for broader repatriations. For Senegalese curator Hamadi Bokoum, restitution is not just about filling galleries, but restoring dignity to Africa's history. He stresses that the process must include documentation, conservation training, and regional cooperation so that returns are sustainable. The Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, holds one of the most painful restitution legacies, rooted in King Leopold II's brutal colonization of the Congo Free State, 1885 to 1908. Millions died under forced labor regimes, while an immense quantity of cultural material, masks, statues, ritual drums, and regalia was transported to Belgium. Located in Tervuren, near Brussels, the Royal Museum for Central Africa long presented an uncritical celebration of Belgium's civilizing mission. In 2018, it reopened after a €75 million renovation, acknowledging colonial atrocities for the first time. However, the DRC government soon demanded the return of artifacts taken without consent. In 2022, Belgium's parliament approved a legal framework allowing the repatriation of around 84,000 objects to the DRC. A joint commission was established to determine provenance and oversee transfers. The process is expected to take years, but it represents one of Europe's most comprehensive restitution programs. Congolese activists emphasize that restitution must be accompanied by structural change. As artist Sami Balogi stated, returning the mask is not enough. We must return the power to interpret it. New Congolese institutions, such as the National Museum of the DRC, opened 2019 in Kinshasa, are intended to support this vision by combining community curation with international partnerships. Restitution in Southern Africa has taken a more personal dimension through the return of human remains and sacred objects. In Namibia, Germany has repatriated skulls and bones of Herero and Nama victims killed during the 1904 to 1908 genocide. These remains had been kept for racial research in German universities. Ceremonies of return in 2011 and 2018 were accompanied by demands for apology and reparations. In South Africa, universities and museums have faced similar reckonings. The University of Cape Town has developed policies for returning ancestral remains to indigenous Khoisan communities, while the Iziko South African Museum has engaged descendant families in reburial ritual.
This is Whispers in Africa. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the true crime documentary. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe and turn on the notification bell icon, so you'll be notified when we upload a new video. You can also tell us what you think about this documentary in the comments section. I hope to see you in our next video. Bye.